There's some questions I really don't know what Heidegger wants to do with them, and I can only speak about them in a weak way, but I feel compelled to nonetheless attempt to tackle them. Jordan Peterson, in an interview with Tucker Carlson a few years ago, made this remark that don't say things that make you weak. Um, Putting aside that I'm not absolutely sure that I understood what he meant by that, um, this question of whether we can take something worthy from our misunderstandings or from however we understand what someone says, I think should be modulated according to how so far we think that person is saying something from a point of greatness, whereas if Heidegger were to say something, we should make every attempt to see what his motive was and what he meant. In other cases, it's less important, I would say, and if we get something worthy out of a misunderstanding, then we can run with that. Maybe I did understand what he said. What I take from the notion that we shouldn't say things that make us weak is that if we say something and we don't really understand what we're saying, we're just repeating something we read somewhere or so. This really won't make sense to the listener because it's, even if they were to go along with it, it's just a rule. A rule is part of being, and human beings do think in that way. I don't think it's necessary that we should privilege that which shows over that which tells, as one says in classes on writing novels. Telling too is part of being, and maybe it's just as important one side of Dasein. But with respect to this question of the logos or calculative thinking on one side, and speech, and this question of language as the house of being, I really don't know how to deal with that because what is the difference between speech? Like, for instance, what Plato's doing when they talk about Plato's, in the Politeia, Plato is sometimes said to be showing a political order in speech, as though he were dreaming it up, so to speak, in speech. And it's said that Socrates sometimes praised to Helen, a female, the goddess of women, and it's as though there's certain other allusions that are as though to say that in ancient Athens, women would gossip in the houses, and that philosophers were compared with women because they would stand in the shadow of the houses and gossip, as it were, and just engage in this behavior, which is otherwise put down as not sufficiently manly. Just speech, just dreaming things up in speech. Gottfried Benn says, come, let us speak. Those who speak are not dead. But in one of his poems, so those who speak are not dead. But the old philosophic ideal was to die and to go into this uncanny or thalmazinic, wondrous realm of philosophy, and there to come to the pure theoria. It's not clear to me how this, and remembering also that logos means speech. It doesn't mean language. There's little talk in Plato about what language is. There's talk about speech and about specific usages and all sorts of things. There's not talk about language in the sense that it comes out in modernity, and language, especially in the sense of Herder, where language gets tied up with culture, an idea of culture, idea of civilization, idea of ethnicity that's not a biological notion. the symbols as holding the culture within them, and the young people growing into those symbols. This is all quite obscure to me. So therefore, I don't know how far one can say, here's the logos inflected thinking, and here is this thinking of the eyes, as it were. Heidegger does say sometimes that makes comments along the line of even those things which aren't connected to a word or so, even in those moments where we're just glancing at something, these are already held by a word, as it were. There may be a moment when we're just captivated by something, but this is the privation of the speaking of it, something along those lines. There's a lot of ambiguity in that. The other question I've been thinking about, and somewhat in connection, I thought I could weave this together in a way. Maybe it's two different subject matter, but I'm thinking of where is this problem of the truth of being compared to I've been looking again and again at the seminar on Nietzsche, and it consists almost entirely of these excoriating remarks about Nietzsche's failure to think the truth of being and the relation with being and so on. And on the positive side of that, or meaning on the sense of explicitly saying what Nietzsche is doing, he says Nietzsche is still doing this adequatio thing, where he constantly tells us truth can't get there. And then Heidegger says the problem Nietzsche has with Descartes is not that Descartes shows us this subject, but that Descartes doesn't do it fully enough. So the subjectivity of life itself is what Nietzsche brings out, the untruth of life itself, the impossibility of getting to truth of the human being in life itself. The only way I can approach the thing I've thought of it about the positive part of the truth of being, the only thing that I see there is that we can try to look at how if being is the same as Dasein, and then we think of Dasein as something that's, let's say, flowing in a way, that how that happens can be identified, and then that would be true, rather than this truth as something like saying. Something like Hegel, where we see we come to through history, we come to understand, not just to be able to see a human being, there's a human being, but also to grasp that when we see a human being, we see we see a being that is equal under the law, which is perhaps the same as saying, if I see one tuft of grass on the ground, I see something which can also be understood by Geist, by the intellect, as one unit, so that one is the same as any other one, that one star, one individual right, one country, one whatever. But with respect to this movement of Dasein, one example that I was thinking of is in art. I would say when an artist shows us something that we don't usually notice, and it makes us think that they're seeing the world maybe more sharply, more freshly, or through a different glance. The film, and this, it's especially striking with film or technological means, with the where you'd think maybe that couldn't happen because it should be neutral. With the films of Jacques Tati, or with the photographs of Andy Warhol, for instance, where it makes you wonder maybe they're seeing something that one doesn't see all the time. On occasion, um, I have the experience of seeing things with a sort of captivation, with a favoring captivation, where I think to myself, well, maybe this is how, say, Van Gogh must have seen things all the time, because that's how he came up with his artwork, because the world was like that for him. But then if we assume this as a Dasein kind of thinking, that it's swirling around like that, so that there's not a question of, this is what Heidegger keeps saying about Nietzsche. It's not that there's a reality that has to, our representation of it has to be adequate, so that everybody's trying to get to that. It's flowing all the time. So the way we see the world is just as real and true as the way Van Gogh sees it. But you could have it so that everybody could start tilting towards a different way of representing the world. And then, such that, say, everyone, maybe it wouldn't be good that everybody would start to be, see the world, let's say, the way the Japanese see the world, who, Americans don't have the same kind of sense of, say, enjoying the blossoms, the way the Japanese blossoms of trees in the spring, for instance, as the way the Japanese do. It doesn't seem as congenial or natural to an American as it does in the Japanese culture. And it seems to be somewhat like the way, if it's so that Van Gogh were captivated by the look of things in a different way than most people are, that that's somewhat similar, and that the whole culture could come into a different look of things. And then I wonder if the truth of being could, in some way, be grasped through the way that happens, through following through the way the change in beings happens, rather than trying to find the final position of the truth where one can rest as a necessary position that would persist forever, and was always in our nature, the human nature, to get to. That I feel like can approach a little better than the question of the difference between speech and language, which I don't have enough to go on in some way. In any case, let's leave that for this thing.